The late afternoon sun hung low over the town, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts. It was one of those quiet days where nothing much seemed to happen. Kids rode bikes down side streets, neighbors waved from porches, and the air smelled faintly of cut grass and distant rain. But for the woman driving home from work, this ordinary evening was about to twist into something she'd never forget. She'd just wrapped up a long day at the legal aid office, where she'd spent hours helping low-income families fight eviction notices and unfair utility bills. Her mind was still buzzing with case files and court dates, but her body was tired. She turned onto Oak Ridge Avenue, windows down, letting the warm breeze brush against her skin. Her hair, full, natural, and proudly worn in a thick afro, moved slightly with the wind. It wasn't just hair to her, it was part of who she was. A statement of identity, of heritage, of refusing to shrink herself to fit someone else's idea of professional. She slowed at a stop sign, checked both ways, and rolled forward. That's when the red and blue lights flashed behind her. At first she thought maybe the patrol car was passing through, but then the siren gave a short, sharp yelp, just enough to get her attention, and she knew. She pulled over to the curb, heart already beginning to beat faster. Though she hadn't done anything wrong, she turned off the engine, placed her hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen, and waited. The officer approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick mustache and a walk that said he owned the street. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just stood by her window, hand resting near his belt. "License and registration," he said, voice flat. She reached for her glove compartment, moving slowly. "Officer, may I ask why I was pulled over?" "Broken taillight," he replied, not looking at her taillight, just staring straight ahead, jaw tight. She glanced in her rearview mirror. Both lights were working fine. She knew because she'd checked them just last week after a client mentioned they looked dim, but she didn't argue. Arguing never helped. She handed over her license and registration without another word. He took them, turned, and walked back to his cruiser. She watched him in the mirror. He didn't run her plates right away. Instead, he leaned against his car, arms crossed, watching her like she might bolt at any second. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Sweat gathered at the back of her neck even though the evening was cool. Finally, he returned. This time his tone had changed, sharper, colder. "Step out of the vehicle." "Why?" she asked, voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I haven't done anything illegal." "You're being uncooperative," he said, hand now resting on his baton. "That's resisting, now get out." She took a slow breath. She knew the drill. Black woman plus police interaction, cornered danger, even when you're innocent. She opened the door carefully, stepped onto the pavement, and kept her hands visible. "Turn around. Place your hands on the roof." She obeyed. The metal was warm under her palms. She heard the rustle of his gear, the click of cuffs being pulled from his belt. "Are you arresting me?" she asked. "For obstruction and resisting," he said, snapping the cuffs on tighter than necessary. "You gave me attitude." "I asked a question," she said quietly. "That's not a crime." He didn't answer. He patted her down roughly, then opened the back door of the cruiser. "Get in." The back seat smelled like stale sweat and disinfectant. She sat as far from the door as possible, trying not to let her fear show. As he drove to the station, she replayed every move in her head. Had she spoken too firmly? Had her hair made him angry? She'd seen it before. How some people treated natural black hair like it was a threat, like it didn't belong in respectable spaces. But she refused to apologize for existing as herself. At the station, things got worse. They booked her under harsh fluorescent lights, taking her fingerprints and mugshot. She asked for a phone call. They ignored her. When she requested to speak to an attorney, the desk sergeant laughed and said, "You're a lawyer? Then you should know better than to mouth off to an officer." She didn't flinch, but inside she was burning. Then came the real humiliation. As she sat in a holding cell, waiting for processing to finish, the same officer, the one who'd pulled her over, walked in with a smirk. He leaned against the bars, arms crossed. "You really think you can roll into court looking like that?" he said, nodding at her hair. "Like some kind of protest sign?" She looked up at him, calm. "My hair is none of your business." "It is when you're standing in front of a judge," he shot back. "You're showing disrespect. Judges don't like that, especially not from people like you." She didn't respond. She just held his gaze until he looked away. But he wasn't done. Later, during the pre-trial paperwork, he followed her into the hallway outside the courtroom. "You better fix that mess on your head before you step in there," he muttered, "or things'll go real bad for you." She walked past him without a word, but his threat lingered in the air like smoke. The next morning, she stood in front of the courthouse, dressed in a crisp white blouse and dark blazer, her afro full and unapologetic. She'd spent the night in a cold cell, but she wasn't broken. If anything, she was more determined. She walked through the heavy doors with her head high, ready to defend herself. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, with old portraits of white judges lining the walls. A few reporters sat in the back. Word had spread about the arrest, and people were curious. The judge, an older man with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, peered down from the bench like he'd already made up his mind. When her name was called, she rose and approached the podium. "State your plea," the judge said without looking up. "Not guilty, Your Honor," she said clearly. The judge finally looked at her, and his eyes narrowed slightly as they landed on her hair. He paused, then cleared his throat. "Counselor," he said slowly, "is that appropriate courtroom attire?" She blinked. "My hair, Your Honor." "Yes, it appears unkempt, disruptive even." "With all due respect," she replied, "my natural hair is not a disruption. It's part of my cultural identity. The Crown Act—" "I'm not here to debate legislation," he interrupted, voice sharp. "This is my courtroom, and in my courtroom, decorum is expected." She took a breath. "I'm showing every bit of decorum, Your Honor. I'm dressed professionally. I'm addressing the court respectfully. My hair doesn't change that." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The officer who arrested her sat in the front row, arms crossed, watching with a satisfied look. The judge leaned forward, eyes cold. "If you refuse to present yourself appropriately, I may hold you in contempt." She stood her ground. "I won't apologize for who I am." That's when the officer stood up. "Your Honor," he said loudly, "I can take care of it. I've got clippers in my cruiser." A few people gasped. Others shifted uncomfortably. But the judge didn't say no. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Before she could react, the officer was walking toward her, pulling a pair of electric clippers from his belt. The sound of them powering on filled the silent room, a low, buzzing hum that made her stomach drop. "No," she said firmly, "you can't do this." But the bailiff stepped forward, blocking her path. The judge looked away, pretending to shuffle papers. And then it happened. In front of lawyers, reporters, and strangers, the officer grabbed her shoulders, tilted her head slightly, and began shaving her hair, right there in the middle of the courtroom. Lock by lock, her afro fell to the floor in soft, dark curls. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She just stood there, trembling, eyes fixed straight ahead, while the room watched in stunned silence. When it was over, her head was completely bald. The officer snapped off the clippers with a smirk and walked back to his seat like he'd just done his civic duty. She touched her scalp gently, feeling the rough stubble. Her hands shook, but her voice didn't when she finally spoke. "Your Honor," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "this is assault. This is degradation. And I will not forget it." The judge cleared his throat again. "Next case." But as she walked back to her seat, head bare but spine straight, something inside her hardened. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It wasn't even about the arrest. This was about dignity. About who gets to decide what's acceptable in a system that was never built for people like her. And she knew, with a quiet certainty, that this story wasn't over. Not even close. The courtroom fell silent after the clippers stopped buzzing. Not the kind of silence that follows a pause in conversation, but the heavy, thick kind, the kind that presses against your ears like cotton. People shifted in their seats, some looking down at their shoes, others stealing glances at the woman standing alone near the defense table, her hand still resting lightly on her newly shaved head. Her scalp felt strange, exposed, raw, almost cold, even though the room was warm. She could feel every draft, every stare, every unspoken judgment hanging in the air like dust. She didn't cry. Not then. Crying would have felt like giving them what they wanted, a show of weakness, a confirmation that they'd broken her. But inside, something deep and ancient ached. It wasn't just about hair. Hair like hers, thick, coiled, natural, had been policed for generations. Called unprofessional, messy, even dangerous in schools, workplaces, and now apparently courtrooms. To have it stripped away in front of strangers by a man who'd already treated her like a criminal for asking a simple question. It felt like more than humiliation. It felt like erasure. The judge cleared his throat again, louder this time, as if trying to shake off the weight of what had just happened. "Next case," he said briskly, already flipping open a new file. But no one moved right away. The officer who'd done it sat back in his chair, arms crossed, one leg bouncing slightly. He didn't look ashamed. If anything, he looked pleased, like he'd restored order, like he'd put someone in their place. A few people in the gallery whispered to each other. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. A young man in the back pulled out his phone, fingers moving fast. Within minutes, a shaky video began circulating online, just 30 seconds long. The officer stepping forward, the buzz of the clippers, the woman standing perfectly still as her hair fell to the floor. The caption read, "They shaved her head in court for having an afro." It spread like wildfire. By lunchtime, local news stations were calling the courthouse for comment. By evening, national headlines picked it up. Social media exploded, not just with outrage but with stories. Black women sharing photos of their own natural hair, recounting times they'd been told to fix it before a job interview, a school picture, a courtroom appearance. Teachers, nurses, engineers, students all saying the same thing. This could have been me. But while the world reacted, the woman herself sat in a small, windowless room at the public defender's office, wrapped in a borrowed sweater that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. She'd been released on her own recognizance after the arraignment. But the charges still stood: obstruction, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct. All because she'd asked why she was being pulled over. A legal aid colleague brought her a cup of tea and sat across from her, eyes full of anger and worry. "You okay?" she asked softly. The woman nodded, then shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's not the hair. I can grow it back. It's the message. Like my body, my identity doesn't belong in that room unless I make it small enough for them to accept." Her friend reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "They wanted to shame you into silence. But you're not silent, and now everyone's watching." That night she couldn't sleep. She kept running her fingers over her scalp, feeling the uneven patches where the clippers had snagged. She thought about calling her mother but stopped herself. Her mom had spent years straightening her hair as a girl, not out of shame, but survival, because the world punished black girls for looking too black. She didn't want to add this pain to her mother's already heavy heart. Instead, she opened her laptop and started typing. Not a social media post, not a rant, a legal complaint. She listed every violation: unlawful arrest, excessive force during detention, violation of the First Amendment, freedom of expression through hairstyle, and cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. She cited the Crown Act, laws passed in several states banning race-based hair discrimination, and referenced federal civil rights statutes. She wrote until her eyes burned and the sky outside turned pale gray. By morning, she'd drafted a federal lawsuit against the officer, the judge, and the county. She didn't do it for revenge. She did it because if she didn't, who would? And if she waited for someone else to fix it, nothing would ever change. She filed the papers that afternoon. The response was immediate and ugly. Local talk radio hosts called her a troublemaker looking for a payday. A city councilman said she was exploiting a minor incident for attention. Online, trolls flooded her social media with cruel comments. "Should have combed your hair. Cops have real problems to deal with. Stop playing the race card. One post even photoshopped her bald head onto a cartoon criminal, but for every hateful message there were 10 more of support. Former clients sent letters. Law students organized vigils outside the courthouse. A group of barbers and hairstylists launched a fundraiser called Hair is Heritage, raising thousands to cover her legal fees. A retired black judge, now in her 80s, sent a handwritten note that simply read, "You stand where I once stood. Keep standing." Still, the system moves slowly. The officer was placed on administrative leave with pay, a common practice even in cases of clear misconduct. The judge issued a brief statement saying he regretted any misunderstanding, but stood by his commitment to courtroom decorum. No apology. No accountability. Meanwhile, the woman prepared for the next phase. She knew the original judge would never recuse himself. He'd see her lawsuit as a personal attack. So she filed a motion requesting a new judge, citing bias and conflict of interest. The court denied it. She appealed. That appeal took weeks. During that time, she kept working. She met with clients, argued motions in other cases, and even gave a quiet interview to a national news outlet, not to play victim, but to explain why this wasn't just about one bad cop or one unfair judge. "This is about who gets to define dignity in America," she said. "And for too long that power has been held by people who don't look like me." Her words resonated. More lawyers joined her legal team pro bono. A civil rights organization offered to take the case to federal court if the state system failed her. She started speaking at community forums, not as a victim, but as a witness, someone who'd seen the machinery of injustice up close and lived to describe it. Then, something unexpected happened. A whistleblower from inside the police department came forward, not with a dramatic confession, but with a quiet email containing internal records. It showed that the officer had been the subject of at least 7 prior complaints, 3 for racial slurs, 2 for excessive force during traffic stops, 1 for tampering with evidence. None had resulted in discipline. In fact, his performance reviews were glowing. The woman's legal team subpoenaed those records. When the city tried to block the release, a federal magistrate judge ordered them unsealed. The documents dropped like a bomb. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. It wasn't just one incident, it was part of a pattern. Reporters dug deeper. They found other people, mostly black, mostly poor, who'd been harassed, arrested, or humiliated by the same officer. One man said the officer had called him boy during a routine ID check. A teenage girl said he'd mocked her braids during a school field trip gone wrong. Public pressure mounted. Protesters gathered outside City Hall every Tuesday, holding signs that read, "Hair is not a crime," and "Respect starts at the roots." Local businesses put up window decals in solidarity. Even the town's mayor, a cautious politician who'd stayed silent at first, released a statement saying he was reviewing department policies. But the woman knew better than to trust statements. She'd seen too many promises evaporate once the cameras left, so she kept preparing. She rehearsed her testimony. She gathered affidavits from witnesses. She studied courtroom procedure until she could recite it in her sleep. And through it all, she kept her head shaved. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. Every time someone saw her bald head, they'd remember what happened. And maybe, just maybe, they'd think twice before treating someone else's identity as a problem to be fixed. Weeks turned into months. The court date for her civil rights hearing was finally set. The original judge, facing mounting scrutiny, quietly recused himself, citing scheduling conflicts, though everyone knew the truth. A new judge would preside. The night before the hearing, she sat alone in her apartment reviewing her notes. Rain tapped gently against the window. She thought about how far she'd come, from that roadside stop to the courthouse floor to this moment. She wasn't the same person anymore. The experience had carved something out of her, yes, but it had also built something new. A quiet, unshakable resolve. She looked in the mirror before bed. Her reflection stared back, bald, tired, but clear-eyed. She didn't see shame. She saw strength. She saw a woman who refused to be erased, and tomorrow she'd walk back into that courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a plaintiff. Not as a victim, but as a voice. She turned off the light and went to sleep, ready for whatever came next. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. The morning of the hearing arrived with a strange kind of calm. No sirens, no shouting crowds, just a soft drizzle falling over the courthouse steps and the quiet hum of nervous energy in the air. She stood under the awning, hands tucked into the pockets of her long coat, watching people file inside. Lawyers in dark suits, reporters with notepads, curious onlookers who'd followed the story online. None of them knew what was really about to happen. Not yet. She'd spent the last few weeks preparing like her life depended on it, because in a way it did. This wasn't just about clearing her name or getting an apology. It was about proving that what happened to her wasn't an accident. It was policy. It was culture. It was the quiet, everyday violence of a system that treated black bodies as problems to be managed, not people to be respected. Her legal team met her at the door. 3 attorneys, all women, all wearing matching pins shaped like afros with tiny scales of justice in the center. One of them handed her a thermos of tea. "You've got this," she whispered. She nodded, but her stomach was tight. Not from fear, from focus. Inside, the courtroom felt different this time. Cleaner, brighter. The portraits on the wall were the same, but the air didn't feel as heavy. Maybe it was because the original judge was gone, or maybe it was because she wasn't standing alone anymore. The new judge hadn't been named yet. Rumor was it would be someone from the federal bench, neutral, experienced, someone who hadn't been part of the town's old ways. She hoped that was true. But hope wasn't a strategy, so she stuck to the facts. As she took her seat at the plaintiff's table, she noticed the officer already there, sitting stiffly in the back with his union lawyer. He didn't look at her, not once. His usual swagger was gone. He kept his eyes on the floor, fingers tapping his knee like he was counting seconds. Good, she thought. Let him feel it. The bailiff called the court to order. Everyone rose, and then the side door opened. A woman in a black robe stepped in, tall, silver-haired, with sharp eyes and a posture that said she'd seen it all and wasn't impressed by any of it. She moved with quiet authority, settling into the high-backed chair like it had been waiting for her. The clerk announced her name, Judge Eleanor Whitmore, appointed by the federal court to oversee this case due to the conflict of interest. The woman exhaled slowly. She'd heard of Judge Whitmore, known for fairness, known for not suffering fools. This was a good sign. The hearing began with opening statements. The city's lawyer, a polished man with a smooth voice, tried to frame the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding. He, said the officer, acted within protocol. The judge upheld courtroom standards, and the plaintiff was seeking to turn a minor disciplinary issue into a national spectacle. She listened without flinching. She'd heard this script before. Minimize, deflect, blame the victim. Then it was her turn. She stood, smoothed her blazer, and walked to the podium. No notes, she didn't need them. This story was in her bones. Your Honor, she began, voice steady. This isn't about a broken taillight. It's not even about hair. It's about who gets to decide what's acceptable in a space that's supposed to belong to everyone. She spoke plainly. No legal jargon, just truth. She described the traffic stop, the way she'd kept her hands visible, the way she'd asked one question, the way that question was treated like a threat. She talked about the booking, the silence when she asked for a lawyer, the officer's comments about her hair in the holding cell. Then she described the courtroom, the buzz of the clippers, the feeling of helplessness, the way no one stopped it. I wasn't just having my hair cut, she said, looking directly at the judge. I was being told in the clearest way possible that my natural self didn't belong in that room, that I had to be smaller, quieter, less black, to be treated with basic dignity. A few people in the gallery nodded. One woman wiped her eyes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She just laid it out. Fact after fact, law after law. She cited the Crown Act, which her state had passed 2 years earlier, explicitly banning discrimination based on natural hairstyles. She pointed out that the officer had no authority to alter her appearance, that the judge had no legal basis to demand it, that what happened was not discipline, it was punishment, and punishment without due process is illegal. When she finished, she sat down. The room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Then came the testimony. First, the officer took the stand. He looked nervous, shifting in his seat, avoiding eye contact with the judge. Under questioning, his story fell apart. He claimed the taillight was out, but when shown photos from the night of the stop taken by a dashcam from a nearby gas station, which her team had subpoenaed, both lights were clearly working. He said she'd been aggressive, but the audio from his own body cam once recovered showed her speaking calmly, even politely. When asked about the hair-cutting incident, he stammered. I thought it was necessary for courtroom decorum, he said. Who gave you permission to shave someone's head? The plaintiff's attorney asked. The judge didn't stop me. That's not permission, the attorney said sharply. That's cowardice, and you took advantage of it. The officer had no answer. Next, the former judge was called, but he refused to testify, citing health reasons. His written statement claimed he never authorized any physical alteration and that the officer acted independently, but the video showed him nodding. And silence in that moment was consent. Then came the witnesses. A retired schoolteacher who'd been in the courtroom that day described the shock, the silence, the way people couldn't look at each other afterward. A young law student said she'd almost quit her program after seeing it. If that's what the law looks like, she'd said, I don't want to be part of it. But the most powerful testimony came from a woman who worked at the courthouse, a black clerk who'd been there for 15 years. She spoke softly, but every word landed. I've seen judges tell women to take off their head wraps, she said. I've seen officers mock braids, twists, afros. We're told to tone it down if we want to be taken seriously. But today, someone finally said no, and I'm glad she did. By mid-afternoon, the mood in the room had shifted. Even the city's lawyer looked uneasy. The evidence was overwhelming. The public outrage was growing. And now, with a fair judge on the bench, the truth had nowhere to hide. During a short recess, she stepped outside for air. Rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off the wet pavement. A small group of supporters stood near the steps, mostly women, many with natural hair, some wearing Hair is Heritage t-shirts. They didn't say much, just smiled, nodded, held up signs that read, "We see you." She felt a lump in her throat. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It never really was. Back inside, closing arguments began. The city's lawyer tried one last time to downplay it. An isolated incident. No lasting harm. Plaintiff is seeking excessive damages. But it rang hollow. Her attorney stood and said simply, Your Honor, this case isn't about money. It's about precedent. If we allow this to stand, if we say it's okay to humiliate someone for how they wear their hair, then we tell every black child in this country that their identity is a liability. That's not justice. That's oppression with a gavel. Judge Whitmore listened, expression unreadable. When both sides finished, she didn't rule immediately. She said she needed time to review the record. Court would reconvene in 2 days for her decision. The woman left the courthouse that evening not with relief, but with resolve. Win or lose, she'd made them see it. Made them name it. That alone was something. Over the next 48 hours, the town held its breath. News vans lined the street. Online, people debated the case endlessly. Some still defended the officer. He was just doing his job. But more and more voices joined the call for change. Even the local bar association issued a statement condemning the courtroom shaving as a gross violation of professional ethics. She spent the time quietly. She visited her mother, who finally let herself cry. She met with a group of high school girls who'd started a natural hair club at their school. She even got a call from a law school dean, offering her a guest lecture spot on civil rights and personal expression. But mostly, she waited. On the morning of the ruling, the courthouse was packed. People stood in the hallway, peered through the glass doors, listened on courthouse radios. She arrived early, wearing the same blazer as before, but this time she'd added a small gold pin to her lapel, a coiled curl with a tiny gavel inside. Judge Whitmore entered promptly at 9. She didn't waste time. After careful review of the evidence, testimony, and applicable law, she began, voice clear and firm. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff. A soft gasp rippled through the room. The actions of Officer Dale Mercer on the date in question constituted unlawful detention, violation of First Amendment rights, and cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. The presiding judge at the time failed in his duty to protect the dignity and rights of a person appearing before the court. Both parties acted in a manner inconsistent with constitutional principles and basic human decency. She went on. The city would be required to pay damages, not just to the plaintiff, but to fund mandatory anti-bias training for all law enforcement and court personnel in the county. The police department would undergo an independent review of its use of force and conduct policies. And most importantly, the court would adopt a formal policy affirming that natural black hairstyles are protected forms of expression and identity, never grounds for discipline, humiliation, or exclusion. When she finished, she looked directly at the woman. "The law exists to protect the vulnerable," she said, "not to enforce conformity. Today, justice has been served, not because the system worked, but because someone refused to let it fail." The room erupted, not in cheers, but in something deeper. A collective exhale, a moment of shared recognition. The officer sat frozen, face pale. His lawyer packed up his briefcase quickly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. As the woman walked out of the courtroom, people parted for her like she was carrying something sacred. Outside, the sun was shining. Cameras flashed, but she didn't stop for interviews. She just kept walking, past the reporters, past the signs, past the courthouse steps, until she reached the sidewalk. There she paused, looked up at the sky, took a deep breath. It wasn't over. There would be appeals, pushback, old habits dying hard. But today something had shifted, not just in policy, but in possibility. She touched her scalp again. Still smooth, still bare, but now it didn't feel like loss. It felt like a beginning. 2 months had passed since the ruling, and life had settled into a new kind of rhythm. The headlines had faded. The news vans were gone. The town, for the most part, had moved on, back to school board meetings, Friday night football, and the slow hum of everyday life. But for her, everything had changed. Not in a flashy way, not with fanfare, but in the quiet certainty that comes when you've stared down injustice and lived to tell the truth about it. She'd turned down most interview requests. Didn't write a book. Didn't launch a podcast. Instead, she went back to work. Still at the legal aid office, still helping families fight evictions, still showing up for people the system forgot. But now when she walked into a courtroom, heads turned for a different reason. Not because of her hair, though she still kept it shaved, a quiet reminder, but because people knew her story. And more than that, they respected her silence, her consistency, her refusal to become a symbol instead of a person. Then came the call. It was a Thursday morning. Rain tapped against the office window as she reviewed a stack of housing complaints. The phone rang once, twice. She picked it up, expecting a client or a court clerk. "Good morning," a calm, familiar voice said. "This is Judge Whitmore's chambers." Her breath caught slightly. She hadn't spoken to the judge since the ruling, though she'd sent a handwritten thank you note that came back with a single line in the margin. "The honor was mine." "Hello, Your Honor," she said, sitting up straighter. "I have a request," the judge continued. No small talk, straight to the point. "There's a civil rights case coming up next week. Another one involving alleged misconduct by law enforcement. It's complex, sensitive, and the assigned magistrate judge just had a family emergency. I need someone I can trust to step in temporarily. Someone who understands both the law and the human cost when it fails." She paused. "You're asking me to preside?" "Not permanently," Judge Whitmore said. "Just for this one hearing." As an interim federal magistrate, the paperwork's already moving through channels. You've got the credentials. You've got the integrity. And frankly, she added, a hint of dry humor in her voice, after what you've been through, I doubt anyone will try to pull anything in your courtroom. The offer hung in the air like a held breath. She thought about it. Really thought. This wasn't just a promotion. It was a responsibility. A burden even, to sit where power lives, to wear the robe that for so long had represented exclusion to people like her. Could she do it without becoming what she'd fought against? Could she hold that space with fairness even when her own wounds were still tender? "Yes," she said finally. "I'll do it." The next few days were a blur of briefings, security clearances, and quiet preparation. No press, no announcements. The court wanted to keep it low-key, partly to avoid controversy, partly to see how things unfolded without the weight of expectation. She studied the case file late into the night. Excessive force during a protest, falsified reports, a young man with a broken arm and no apology. It felt hauntingly familiar. The morning of the hearing, she woke before dawn. She ironed her best suit, navy blue, sharp lines, no frills. She didn't wear jewelry, except for the small gold curl pin, and she kept her head bare, not as a statement this time, but as herself. At the courthouse, a clerk met her at a side entrance away from the public lobby. "Your Honor," the clerk said, handing her a black robe still warm from the press. She slipped it on. The fabric was heavier than she expected. It settled on her shoulders like a promise. She was led through quiet hallways, past closed doors and hushed conversations. People she passed, bailiffs, attorneys, even janitors, paused and nodded. Not out of protocol, but respect. She didn't smile. Didn't acknowledge them. She just walked, focused, steady. When she reached the courtroom, she didn't go in right away. She stood outside the heavy oak door, hand resting on the cool metal handle. She thought of that day months ago, the buzz of clippers, the silence, the feeling of being erased. And now here she was, about to step into the very seat that had once been used to diminish her. She took a breath, pushed the door open. The room was already filling. Lawyers at their tables, reporters in the back, a few spectators in the gallery. No one recognized her, not yet. They saw a figure in a robe, face calm, posture straight. Just another judge. She walked to the bench, turned, and sat. Only then did she look out at the room. And that's when she saw him. He was sitting in the front row on the defense side. Same broad shoulders, same stiff posture, though he looked older, wearier. The officer. He hadn't noticed her yet. He was flipping through a file, jaw set, probably rehearsing his version of the truth one more time. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. But something deep inside her stilled, like a compass needle finally finding true north. The bailiff called the court to order. Everyone rose. "Please be seated," she said, her voice clear, calm, carrying just enough weight to fill the room. That's when he looked up. His eyes locked onto hers, and froze. His file slipped from his fingers. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. Color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. He stared unblinking as if seeing a ghost. Or a reckoning. She didn't react. Didn't smirk. Didn't even blink. She simply looked at him the way a judge looks at any witness, with neutral attention, waiting. The clerk began the docket. Civil Case 24-27. Plaintiff versus Officer Dale Mercer in the county of... The officer's name hung in the air. He flinched. This wasn't the same case as before. This was a new lawsuit, filed by a different person about a different incident. But his name was on it, and now, the woman he'd humiliated in this very room was the one holding the gavel. The plaintiff's attorney stood first. "Your Honor, we call Officer Mercer to the stand." The officer didn't move at first. He looked around as if hoping someone would stop this, tell him it was a mistake. But no one did. The bailiff gestured toward the witness stand. Slowly, stiffly, he stood. His boots thudded against the floor like a drumbeat. He walked to the stand, eyes darting everywhere except at her. When he finally sat, he gripped the edge of the chair like it might save him. "Please state your name for the record," she said. He swallowed hard. Dale Mercer. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do," he mumbled. She didn't rush him. Didn't raise her voice. She let the silence stretch just long enough to make him feel it. The weight of where he was and who was watching. The questioning began. The plaintiff's lawyer was sharp, methodical. She walked Mercer through the night of the protest. How he'd shoved a peaceful demonstrator to the ground. How he'd claimed the man lunged at him. How the body cam footage showed no such thing. Mercer's answers were shaky. He contradicted himself. He blamed the chaos of the moment. He said he felt threatened. But every time he glanced toward the bench, his voice faltered. Because she was there. Not as a victim. Not as an accuser. But as the law itself. At one point, the lawyer asked, "Officer Mercer, have you ever been disciplined for misconduct?" He hesitated. "No, not officially." "What about the incident in this courthouse last year? When you shaved a woman's head during her arraignment?" He stiffened. That was a different situation, was it? You were placed on administrative leave. A federal judge ruled your actions violated her constitutional rights. Isn't that correct?" He nodded barely. "And yet," the lawyer pressed, "you're still on the force. Still making arrests. Still testifying as if you're a credible officer of the law. How do you explain that? Mercer looked down. I've completed the required training. Training doesn't erase harm, the lawyer said quietly, especially when the harm is repeated. He had no answer. When it was the defense's turn, their lawyer tried to rehabilitate him. He's a dedicated public servant. One mistake doesn't define a career. He's remorseful. But it rang hollow, especially with her watching. During a short recess, Mercer didn't leave the courtroom. He stayed in his seat, head in his hands. She watched him from the bench, not with anger, but with a kind of sad clarity. He wasn't evil. He was ordinary, and that was the real tragedy. Ordinary people given unchecked power, doing ordinary cruelty and calling it duty. When court resumed, she handled the proceedings with precision. She ruled on objections fairly. She kept the lawyers on track. She made sure the plaintiff's voice was heard, and through it all, she never once referenced her own history with the officer. She didn't need to. His presence in that chair under her gaze was punishment enough. By late afternoon, closing arguments were done. She didn't rule from the bench. She said she'd issue a written decision within the week. But as she stood to adjourn, she looked directly at Mercer one last time. "Officer," she said, voice calm but firm, "the court expects full compliance with all future orders, and I trust you understand that credibility is earned, not assumed." He nodded, eyes downcast. "Yes, Your Honor." She turned to the clerk. "Court is adjourned." As she walked out, robe flowing behind her, she didn't look back. But she could feel the shift in the room, the quiet awe, the dawning realization that power could change hands. That justice could wear a different face. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. She removed her robe in the judge's chamber, folded it carefully, and handed it back to the clerk. "Thank you, Your Honor," the clerk said softly. She smiled faintly. "Just call me by my name." She walked out the same side entrance back into the world. No cameras, no crowds. Just a woman in a navy suit, head bare, walking home under a changing sky. But something had shifted, not just in that courtroom, but in the story itself. The one who was once silenced now held the gavel, and the one who thought he was untouchable. He finally understood what it felt like to be seen. The written decision came a week later, delivered quietly through official channels, not with fanfare, but with the steady weight of law. In clear, unflinching language, the ruling found that the officer's actions during the protest had violated the plaintiff's civil rights, excessive force, false reporting, and a pattern of behavior inconsistent with constitutional policing. The county was ordered to pay damages, implement new de-escalation protocols, and submit to independent oversight for the next 2 years. Most significantly, the court noted that past misconduct, when unaddressed, becomes a license for future harm, a line that would be quoted in legal briefs for years to come. But the real impact wasn't in the pages of the ruling. It was in the silence that followed. The officer didn't return to active duty. Within a month, he resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. No press conference, no defiant interview, just an empty locker and a name removed from the roster. For those who'd watched him swagger through the station for years, it felt like the ground had shifted under his feet, and he'd finally fallen. As for her, she didn't stay on the bench. The interim appointment ended as planned. She handed back the robe, thanked the clerks, and walked out of the courthouse the same way she'd walked in. Calm, focused, human. She never sought a judgeship, never campaigned for office. She knew her power wasn't in titles, it was in presence, in showing up again and again for people who'd been told they didn't matter. Instead, she did something quieter, but maybe more lasting. She started a small nonprofit, just a rented office above a bookstore. A few folding chairs, a coffee pot that never quite worked right. She called it the Dignity Project. Its mission was simple: to protect the rights of people who face humiliation, bias, or abuse inside courtrooms and police stations, not just through lawsuits, but through education, advocacy, and something even more radical: accompaniment. She trained volunteers, law students, retired teachers, community elders to sit with people during court appearances, especially those who were Black, poor, or marginalized, not as lawyers but as witnesses, as reminders that someone sees you, that you're not alone, They'd sit in the gallery, take notes, offer a tissue, or just hold space. Sometimes that was enough to change the tone of a hearing. Sometimes it stopped an officer from raising his voice. Sometimes it gave someone the courage to speak their truth. She also worked with local schools, teaching teenagers about their rights during police encounters. She partnered with barbershops and salons, turning them into safe spaces where people could learn about the Crown Act and how to file complaints if they were discriminated against for their hair. She even helped draft a new courtroom conduct policy adopted by 3 counties. Clear language stating that natural hairstyles, head wraps, braids, locks, and afros are not disruptive and never grounds for removal or discipline. People asked her if she felt vindicated. She always shook her head. "Vindication sounds like an ending," she'd say. "This isn't over. It's just getting started," and in a way she was right, because the story didn't end in a courtroom. It spilled out into the streets, into classrooms, into living rooms where parents now told their daughters, "Wear your hair however you want. The law's on your side." It showed up in job interviews where HR managers thought twice before asking someone to tone down their appearance. It echoed in police academies where new recruits watched the courtroom video, not as entertainment, but as a warning. One afternoon, months later, she was walking through the downtown square when a young girl, maybe 10 years old, ran up to her, eyes wide. She had a full, beautiful afro tied back with a bright yellow ribbon. "Are you the lady from the video?" the girl asked, breathless. She knelt down so they were eye to eye. "I am." The girl reached out, gently touched her bald head, then pulled her hand back quickly, embarrassed. "Sorry, I saw it, and my mom said you stood up for us," she smiled. "I stood up for me. But it turned out that helped you too." The girl beamed. "I'm growing mine out," she whispered, pointing to her hair. "No more straightening. That's brave," she said. "And beautiful." The girl ran back to her mother, who stood a few feet away, watching with tears in her eyes. She gave a small nod. No words needed. That night she sat at her desk sorting through mail. Most of it was legal notices, donation requests, thank you letters. One envelope stood out, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 sentences. "I used to think the system was broken. Now I know it was built this way. Thank you for helping us rebuild it." She folded the note and tucked it into her journal, right next to the judge's margin note from months ago. She didn't keep trophies, didn't hang headlines on her wall, but she kept these small things, proof that change wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was a whisper between 2 people. A nod, a touch, a choice to show up differently tomorrow. A few weeks after that, she got another call from the State Bar Association. They wanted her to lead a new task force on courtroom equity. She agreed, but only if it included voices from the communities most affected, formerly incarcerated people, public defenders, mental health advocates, even court clerks who'd seen it all from the sidelines. The first meeting was held not in a government building, but in a community center, with paper plates of food and kids playing in the next room. She opened by saying, "We're not here to fix the system. We're here to ask, who does it serve, and who does it silence?" The room fell quiet. Then one by one, people began to speak. That's when she knew this was the real work. Not the gavel, not the robe, not even the courtroom. It was the table. The space where people who've been shut out finally get to shape what justice looks like. Years later, when people told her story, they'd often focus on the dramatic moment. The shaving, the courtroom, the officer's stunned face when she took the bench. But she always corrected them. The real moment, she'd say, was the morning after, when I woke up bald, sore, and scared, and still chose to get out of bed. Still chose to fight, not with anger, but with purpose. Because justice isn't a single act. It's a daily practice. It's showing up when you're tired, speaking up when you're afraid, and sometimes it's just sitting in a room full of strangers and saying, "Tell me what you've seen." She never became famous, never wrote a memoir. But in that town and in others like it, her name became shorthand for something quiet and powerful. Do it like she did. Stand firm. Stay kind. Never let them make you small. And on the wall of her tiny office, above the broken coffee pot and the stack of legal pads, she hung one thing, a photo not of herself, but of a group of young people at a courthouse rally. They're holding signs that say, "Our hair, our right, and respect starts here." In the center, a girl with a big afro is smiling, fearless. She looks at that photo every day, not as a reminder of what was done to her, but as a promise of what's Possible. Because the courtroom didn't change. She changed the courtroom, and in doing so, she gave others permission to walk in, heads high, hair free, dignity intact, knowing they belong there just as they are. No permission needed, no apologies required, just truth, spoken clearly in a room that finally learned to listen.